In a vast and desolate terrain, beneath the relentless heat of the Gilead sun, there appeared a man who was destined to become one of the most renowned prophets in all of human history. His name was Elijah, known also as Elijah the Tishbite. His reputation spread far and wide, even without the aid of written records. Elijah's influence surpassed that of many kings who ruled during the 9th century BC. Elijah stood as a symbol of truth, fearlessly confronting kings and reviving faith in a kingdom that had fallen into darkness. His role in the divine plan was significant, as prophesied in Malachi 4:5, where it says, "Look, I will send Elijah the prophet to you before the arrival of the great and terrible day of the Lord." This prophecy deeply resonated with those eagerly awaiting the arrival of God's messenger. The mystery surrounding Elijah's appearance only added to his captivating presence. While the Bible mentions his connection to Gilead, little else is known about his family or background, which only served to increase the curiosity surrounding this remarkable prophet. Elijah's impact extended beyond mere words or deeds. He became a symbol of hope and a reminder of the power of faith in troubled times. His story continues to inspire countless individuals to this day, serving as a testament to the enduring legacy of a man who stood boldly for what he believed in. If you find this type of content about the Bible's teachings interesting, I kindly ask for your support by subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you won't miss any of our future videos. Elijah was known not only for his powerful words, but also for his incredible physical stamina. In the Bible, specifically in 1 Kings 17:1, we read about his stern message to King Ahab, where he foretold a severe drought. Elijah's endurance was extraordinary. He once outran Ahab's chariot from Mount Carmel, showcasing his impressive physical strength. His life was filled with remarkable events and divine miracles. After his confrontation with Ahab, God directed him to the brook Chariot, where he was sustained in a miraculous way by ravens bringing him food. When the brook eventually dried up, God commanded Elijah to go to Zarephath in Sidon. There, a widow, as foretold, took him in. In Luke 4:26, it is mentioned that Elijah performed a miracle by providing an unending supply of food for the widow. Also, in Luke 17:8-10, there is a parable about the humility and duties of a servant, reflecting Elijah's obedient journey. Despite being a mighty prophet, Elijah always remained a devoted servant to God. His story is filled with lessons of faith and miracles, spanning from the valleys of Gilead to the far regions of Aria and Galilee. These tales teach us about obedience and trust in God. In one village, during his travels, Elijah had a notable encounter. 10 men suffering from leprosy, isolated and in desperate need, cried out to Jesus for mercy, seeking healing. Jesus saw them and instructed them to go and show themselves to the priests. This act of faith led to their healing. Among the healed, one man, a Samaritan, returned to give thanks to Jesus, praising God. This showed that God's grace is for everyone. Upon reaching Zarephath, Elijah encountered a widow struggling with severe scarcity. She was down to her last bit of flour and oil, facing the prospect of running out of food entirely. However, Elijah brought her a message filled with hope and divine assurance. Elijah asked her for a loaf of bread and promised that her supplies would not run out until the rains returned. This promise put the widow's faith to the test. During this challenging time, her son became gravely ill, adding to her distress and doubt. At the height of her despair, the widow confronted Elijah, expressing her anguish and questioning God's plan. Elijah, full of compassion and faith in God's power, took the boy to his room and interceded for him. He stretched himself over the boy and fervently prayed to God, pleading for his life. A miraculous event followed. The boy was revived, his life restored. Witnessing this, the mother saw God's power manifested through Elijah and recognized him as a true man of God, whose words carried divine truth. This miracle not only affirmed Elijah's mission, but also showcased God's mercy in times of great suffering. The widow's faith was renewed, and the miracle stood as a testament to God's presence and power. Following this event, Elijah faced another significant challenge on Mount Carmel. The land was suffering from a severe drought, and God commanded Elijah to present himself to King Ahab with the promise of sending rain. This set the scene for one of the most dramatic showdowns between genuine faith and idolatry. At the same time, Ahab was dealing with a devastating famine in Samaria. Obadiah, a faithful servant of the Lord, played a vital role in protecting God's prophets from Jezebel's murderous campaign. On Mount Carmel, Elijah's faith and God's power would be displayed in a powerful confrontation. Elijah, knowing the dangers ahead, bravely set out to obey God's command. His journey was full of faith and difficulties. Each event, from the amazing provision at the widow's house to the intense showdown on Mount Carmel, showed his consistent trust in God. These moments highlighted Elijah's role as one of Israel's greatest prophets, demonstrating God's power and faithfulness through his life. During the severe drought, King Ahab and his servant Obadiah sought desperately to save their remaining livestock. They split up to search for pasture, with Ahab going one way and Obadiah another. Along his path, Obadiah unexpectedly met Elijah and recognized him as the prophet. Obadiah greeted Elijah with respect, but also expressed his fear. He knew Ahab was tirelessly hunting for Elijah and feared the consequences of revealing his presence. Despite Obadiah's lifelong devotion to God and his history of protecting the Lord's prophets, even risking his life against Jezebel's threats, he was still afraid of Ahab's potential retaliation. Though Obadiah was steadfast in his loyalty to God, he was anxious about Ahab's response. Elijah, however, reassured Obadiah, promising to meet Ahab himself. This pledge was more than just a meeting. It marked a test of faith and foreshadowed the greater challenge ahead on Mount Carmel. Following Elijah's instructions, Obadiah went to tell Ahab about the prophet's presence. When Ahab met Elijah, he accused him of causing Israel's problems. Elijah strongly denied this, asserting that Israel's suffering stemmed from their worship of idols and disobedience to God. Elijah then proposed a decisive showdown on Mount Carmel. He called for all of Israel to gather, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah. This gathering was a critical moment, urging people to choose whom they would follow, the Lord or Baal. On Mount Carmel, facing a divided crowd, Elijah presented them with a clear decision: to serve the Lord or worship Baal. His message was direct and unambiguous, challenging the people to make a definitive decision. The test he proposed was simple yet profound. 2 bulls would be prepared, one for the prophets of Baal and one for Elijah. The true God would be the one who answered by sending fire from heaven to consume the offering. The gravity of the challenge dawned on the people, and they agreed to the test. Elijah instructed the prophets of Baal to select and prepare their bull first, and call upon their God to ignite the fire. This moment was not merely a test of divine power. It was a confrontation between genuine faith and the idolatrous practices that had led Israel astray. The prophets of Baal, in their desperation, began calling on their God from morning until noon, but their cries went unanswered. As the hours passed and the silence remained, they resorted to more extreme measures, cutting themselves with swords and spears, hoping that their blood would provoke a response from Baal. Elijah, watching their futile efforts, mocked them, suggesting that perhaps Baal was busy, deep in thought, or traveling. Their desperation intensified, but despite their loud cries and self-inflicted wounds, there was no answer, no fire, no sign from Baal. Then Elijah called the people to gather closer. In front of everyone, he began to repair the Lord's altar, which had been neglected and broken down. Using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, he rebuilt the altar, reminding the people of their shared heritage and covenant with God. Elijah's actions were methodical and symbolic. He dug a trench around the altar, arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then, to ensure there could be no doubt about the miracle that was about to occur, he instructed the people to fill 4 large jars with water and pour it over the offering and the wood. They did this 3 times, until the water ran down around the altar and filled the trench. Once everything was prepared, Elijah stepped forward and prayed to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He asked God to let it be known that he is the true God in Israel and that Elijah was his servant. He prayed for God to answer so that the people would know that the Lord was turning their hearts back again. Immediately, the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and even the water in the trench. When the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" This miraculous display of divine power reaffirmed their faith and exposed the futility of Baal worship. Elijah then commanded the people to seize the prophets of Baal, and they were taken down to the Kishon Valley and executed. This event marked a significant turning point for Israel, a powerful reminder of God's sovereignty, and a call to return to Him with wholehearted devotion. Elijah emphasized the unity and spiritual legacy of Israel. Diligently, he arranged his sacrifice, placing the pieces of the bull on the wood. To heighten the challenge, he directed that water be poured over the altar, not just one time, but 3 times, completely drenching the sacrifice and the wood. The trench around the altar brimmed with water, making it clear that only a genuine miracle could ignite the offering. When it was time for the sacrifice, Elijah moved ahead and prayed. His prayer wasn't just about seeing a miracle. It was also about guiding the people's hearts back to God. He requested the Lord to display His power and remind the people of their covenant. In response, fire from heaven consumed the offering, wood, altar stones, and even the water. Witnessing this undeniable miracle, the people bowed in awe, declaring, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Elijah, executing divine justice, ordered the capture of the prophets of Baal. They were taken to the Kishon Brook and executed, symbolizing the end of idolatry and the renewal of Israel's commitment to God. With the defeat of the prophets of Baal and the people's faith restored, Elijah announced the coming rain. After this victory, Elijah climbed Mount Carmel, humbly praying for rain. He sent his servant to look towards the sea 7 times. On the 7th attempt, the servant saw a small cloud rising, signaling the much-needed rain. Soon, heavy rain fell, a sign of God's mercy and power. This rain not only quenched the land, but also symbolized renewal and blessing for Israel. Yet Elijah's victory brought severe consequences. Jezebel, furious over the loss of her prophets, threatened Elijah's life. Fearing for his safety, Elijah fled. Despite his triumph and the people's renewed faith, Elijah faced new challenges, showing that even great prophets experience fear and adversity. Feeling really sad and scared, Elijah went off by himself towards Beersheba in Judah, leaving his servant behind. He was super tired and feeling hopeless, so he went to be alone in the wilderness. There, he felt totally beaten and just didn't want to keep going. Elijah even said he wanted to die. In this really tough moment, Elijah showed that he was just like any of us, feeling down and stuck sometimes. Under a small bit of shade from a broom tree in the wilderness, he found a temporary place to rest. When things were at their worst, an angel from God came to him, bringing food and comfort. The bread and water the angel brought weren't just for his stomach. They showed that God was with him, taking care of him. When the angel visited again, Elijah was told to eat up for the long journey ahead. With this special food from God, Elijah traveled for 40 days and nights until he got to Mount Horeb, a place where people met God and learned important things. After Elijah beat the prophets of Baal, Queen Jezebel promised to hurt him. So, feeling weighed down by his mission and scared of what might happen, Elijah found a cave on Mount Horeb to hide in. This cave became a place where he had a big moment of understanding and finding himself. While he was in the cave, God asked Elijah why he was there. Elijah talked about how much he believed in God, but also said he felt really alone and sad. By being honest with God, Elijah showed how strong his faith was and how serious the problems in Israel were. Then, God didn't make a big show with strong winds, earthquakes, or fires. Instead, he spoke to Elijah in a soft, quiet whisper. This gentle but powerful moment reminded Elijah that God isn't only found in big, impressive displays, but also in the calm, quiet times. When Elijah heard this soft voice, he showed deep respect by covering his face with his cloak and leaving the cave. Once again, God spoke to him, and Elijah repeated how dedicated he was. Then God gave him new things to do, showing that a new part of his job as a prophet was starting. He was told to go to the desert near Damascus and make Hazael the king of Syria, Jehu the king of Israel, and Elisha his successor as a prophet. This wasn't just about Elijah's mission continuing. It also showed that God had a plan for Israel that would keep going. God also comforted Elijah by telling him that there were still 7,000 people in Israel who stayed true to God and didn't worship Baal. Knowing this gave Elijah some peace and hope, showing him that he wasn't alone in what he was doing. Feeling renewed after this meeting with God, Elijah wasn't just excited about the new things he had to do, but also about knowing that his work would live on even after he was gone. With this new perspective, he started doing what God had told him. His first step was finding Elisha, who was working in the fields. By putting his cloak on Elisha, Elijah showed that he was passing on the role of being a prophet. Understanding how important this was, Elisha left his work in the fields to follow Elijah, starting a new part of Israel's history with prophets. When Elijah called Elisha, Elisha showed a lot of respect for his family by asking to say goodbye to them. This was a big deal because it showed how much he appreciated his upbringing and how he was ready to start a new life as a prophet. Elijah understood how important this was and let Elisha do what he needed to do. So, Elisha did something symbolic. He killed the oxen he used for plowing and shared the meat with people, showing that his old life was over and his new life as God's servant was beginning. The switch from Elijah to Elisha wasn't just a simple thing. It was a big change. By taking Elijah's cloak, Elisha chose to dedicate himself to serving the Lord, something that would shape his future. Then, he went to Damascus, where the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, was really sick. The king wanted to know what would happen to him, so he sent Hazael with gifts to Elisha, hoping to get a message from God. When Hazael met Elisha, the prophet gave him a mysterious message. The king would get better, but eventually he would die. This strange message didn't just talk about the king's future. It also showed how God's plans are really complicated and how Hazael was part of them. Seeing what would happen in the future, Elisha cried because he knew the suffering Hazael would bring to the people of Israel. This made a big impact on him. Hazael didn't understand why Elisha was crying, so he didn't fully get how important his actions would be. When Elisha accepted his role as a prophet, it started a new part of his life, full of important purposes and tough challenges. As he went on his journey, he continued Elijah's mission. Speaking and acting for God, his meetings and prophecies changed the fate of nations and showed how what people do is connected to what God wants. When Elisha told Hazael that he would become king, Hazael doubted himself, unsure if he could do such awful things. But Elisha was firm, saying he was just passing on what God had shown him. So Hazael went back to Ben-Hadad, and soon after, the king died, just like Elisha said. Then there's the story of Naboth and his vineyard. King Ahab really wanted Naboth's vineyard to turn it into a garden. He offered to trade or pay for it, but Naboth said no, because he wanted to keep his family's land, following God's laws. Sadly, this decision ended up costing him his life. Ahab got really mad when Naboth said no, and he went back to his palace all upset. His reaction showed not only what kind of person he was, but also how corrupt things were in Israel at that time. Ahab's wife, Jezebel, challenged his authority, saying that as king, he should be able to take whatever he wanted. With bad intentions, Jezebel came up with a plan to get the vineyard, not caring about what was right or fair. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his seal, and sent them to the leaders of Naboth's city. The letters told them to have a fast and set up a fake trial against Naboth, accusing him of saying bad things about God and the king, which could get him killed. Jezebel's plan worked perfectly. Naboth was honored at first, but then humiliated in public. The city leaders did what Jezebel said, getting fake witnesses to say bad things about Naboth. This led to Naboth being stoned to death. This terrible act showed how messed up things were in the kingdom. Naboth's death wasn't just sad for him and his family. It showed how corrupt and abusive those in power had become. Jezebel's scheming and the leaders' cooperation showed how far they had strayed from what was right and fair. Naboth's death was a reminder of how important it is to have integrity and how bad things can get when people are greedy and corrupt. It showed the difference between those who stayed true to God's laws and those who used their power for their own gain. This story, with its betrayals and lessons, emphasized the need for justice, integrity, and consequences for doing wrong. Jezebel's plan worked, and Naboth was wrongly accused and put to death. His tragic end was the result of manipulation and the unchecked greed of those in power, marking a dark time in Israel's history under Ahab's rule. After Naboth was killed, Jezebel wasted no time in telling Ahab that the vineyard was now his. With Naboth out of the way, Ahab eagerly took possession of the vineyard, showing how far he had fallen under Jezebel's corrupting influence. As soon as Ahab took control of the vineyard, God spoke to Elijah. God told Elijah to confront Ahab, accusing him of murder and theft. This meeting between Elijah and Ahab was filled with tension and spiritual importance. Elijah, following God's instructions, met Ahab in the vineyard and delivered a strong message from God. Because of what he had done, Ahab and his family would face serious consequences. Elijah warned that Ahab's family would suffer the same fate as Naboth. When Ahab saw Elijah, he called him his enemy, but Elijah spoke the truth about Ahab's evil deeds. Elijah predicted the downfall of Ahab's family and a tragic end for Jezebel. These prophecies showed that divine justice would come in response to their corruption and wickedness. The story of Naboth, Ahab, and Jezebel reminds us of the consequences of sin, greed, and injustice. Ahab's encounter with Elijah in Naboth's vineyard wasn't just a confrontation. It was a moment of judgment from God. Elijah's words showed how serious their actions were and the punishment that would follow. Ahab's downfall and Jezebel's fate highlighted the inevitable consequences of their immoral behavior. This story shows the clear difference between good and evil, reminding us that no injustice goes unnoticed by God. While Naboth's death was tragic, it led to divine intervention, ensuring that justice would ultimately win. It stands as a testament to the timeless values of righteousness, justice, and the moral order established by God. This story highlights how important it is to stay true to God, even when things get really tough. Elijah's warning to Ahab was both harsh and symbolic. He said that dogs would eat up Ahab's family members who died in the city, and birds would eat those who died in the fields. This punishment was aimed at Ahab because he had turned away from God, following idols and doing things that went against what God wanted. When Ahab heard what Elijah said, he surprisingly changed his attitude. He tore his clothes and put on sackcloth, a sign of mourning and asking for forgiveness. This change in Ahab's behavior showed that even in the darkest times, there's a chance to turn things around. God's power, shown through Elijah, made this clear. But even though Ahab showed he was sorry, the story didn't end there. The story kept going, focusing on who would be king next and what would happen with the prophetic mission. Ahab's time as king ended, and his son Ahaziah became king. Ahaziah was hurt and desperate, so he looked for advice from Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, instead of trusting in the God of Israel. An angel told Elijah to stop the messengers on their way to Ahaziah and ask why they were going to a false god for advice. Elijah told them that because Ahaziah didn't trust in God, he wouldn't get better from his injury. He would die. This prophecy showed that Ahaziah's lack of faith and his choice to look for help from someone other than God had serious consequences. Elijah's talk with Ahaziah's messengers showed what happens when people turn away from God and worship false gods. The prophecy about Ahaziah's death showed how serious his actions were and the punishment that came because of them. This story, with its focus on asking for forgiveness, God's fairness, and not worshiping false gods, reminds us how important it is to stay faithful to God and trust in His justice. When the messengers came back to Ahaziah with Elijah's message, the king asked who had spoken to them. When he heard their description, Ahaziah realized it was Elijah the Tishbite. Determined to confront Elijah, Ahaziah sent a captain with 50 men to capture him. Elijah, standing firm in his role as God's prophet, declared a divine judgment. If he truly represented God, fire would come down from heaven and consume the captain and his men. And as he proclaimed, fire descended from heaven, demonstrating once again that God's power was indeed with Elijah. Unfazed, Ahaziah sent another captain with 50 men. Again, Elijah said the same thing, and fire from heaven consumed them too. Ahaziah didn't give up and sent a third captain with 50 men. But this captain, knowing what happened before and recognizing Elijah's connection to God, approached with humility and respect. He knelt before Elijah, asking for mercy for himself and his men. Seeing the captain's humble attitude and respect for God's power, the angel of the Lord told Elijah to go with him without fear. This moment showed that humility and acknowledgement of divine authority can change things, even in tense and dangerous situations. The story of Ahab's desire for Naboth's vineyard and Jezebel's schemes to get it shows a situation of great unfairness and corruption. Ahab meeting Elijah in the vineyard reminds us that God's justice always wins over human plans. God's response to Ahab's change of heart was to delay the disaster that had been predicted for his family. This shows God's kindness and His willingness to respond when people truly repent. The story of Elijah and Ahaziah adds to the lesson that followers can't be better than their leader and servants can't be greater than their Lord. In the end, these stories teach us about the importance of staying faithful, being honest, and recognizing God's authority. They show how genuine repentance and humility before God are powerful, and they remind us that God's justice and kindness last forever. Ahaziah made the same mistake as his father Ahab by seeking advice from false gods, showing a pattern of disobedience and rebellion throughout his rule. When Elijah confronted Ahaziah's messengers, it showed how true prophets of God have authority and power. Despite facing threats from the king's forces, Elijah stayed strong in his mission to speak God's word, fearlessly challenging earthly power. In the last part of Elijah's life, he and Elisha journeyed from Gilgal together. Knowing he was going to be taken to heaven soon, Elijah told Elisha to stay in Gilgal. But Elisha, loyal and dedicated, refused to leave Elijah, determined to stay with him until the end. Elisha's loyalty led him to stay by Elijah's side throughout their journey. When they reached Bethel, the prophet's sons questioned Elisha about why he was following Elijah. Elisha asked them to be quiet, showing his respect and calmness in this important moment. The journey continued to Jericho, where the sons of the prophets asked Elisha again. With the same determination, Elisha said he would stay with Elijah until the end. When they got to the Jordan River, Elijah did a miracle. He hit the water with his cloak, and the river parted so they could walk across on dry land. This showed God's power working through Elijah. After they crossed, Elijah asked Elisha what he wanted before he was taken to heaven. Elisha, knowing how important this moment was, asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Elijah said it was a hard thing to ask for, but if Elisha saw him being taken, his request would be granted. As they talked, a chariot of fire with horses of fire appeared, separating them. Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, and Elisha saw it all happen. Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen and went back to the Jordan. He hit the water with the cloak and asked, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The river parted again, showing that Elisha had received Elijah's spirit. This marked the start of Elisha's journey as the new leading prophet, continuing Elijah's mission with God's power and guidance. The story of Elijah going to heaven and Elisha taking over shows how important it is to have strong faith, loyalty, and to keep doing God's work through dedicated servants. It shows that God's power and presence continue through His chosen prophets, making sure His mission goes on even as one chapter ends and another begins. Elisha, eager to carry on his master's work, asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. This showed his desire to serve God as faithfully as Elijah had. When Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind with fiery horses, Elisha watched, feeling both amazed and sad. After Elijah was gone, Elisha tore his own clothes, showing that his time learning from Elijah was over, and his own ministry as Israel's main prophet was starting. The crossing of the Jordan River, Elijah going to heaven, and Elisha's request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit all have deep meaning. They show that God's work through His prophets continues from one generation to the next. Elisha went back alone, carrying Elijah's cloak. When Elisha hit the Jordan River with Elijah's cloak, it showed that Elijah's spirit was now with him. This meant that Elijah's work as a prophet would go on through Elisha. In Jericho, the other prophet's sons saw that Elisha had Elijah's authority. They treated him with respect, confirming that Elijah's spirit was with Elisha. This was the start of Elisha's time as Israel's main prophet. Even though they knew Elisha was the new leader, the other prophet's sons still wanted to look for Elijah. Elisha didn't want them to because he knew Elijah was gone, but he finally agreed. They searched, but couldn't find him, showing that Elijah really had gone to heaven. Elisha's time as a prophet was just as powerful as Elijah's. He got the double portion of Elijah's spirit he asked for, which let him do miracles and lead Israel with God's help. Elisha's journey from being loyal to Elijah to taking on the role of prophet shows how important it is to be faithful to God and to keep His work going through dedicated servants. Elijah's prophecy about the downfall of Ahab's family came true during the reign of Jehu. Jehu saw Elijah's words as a guiding light, giving him a reason to completely wipe out Ahab's family and fulfill God's judgment. His mission to cleanse Israel from the influence of Ahab's family started with getting rid of all Ahab's associates and relatives in Jezreel. Jehu's relentless determination to carry out God's word brought about significant change and purification in Israel. As Jehu headed to Samaria, he came across Ahaziah, the king of Judah's brothers. He had them captured and executed without delay, staying true to his goal of wiping out anyone connected to Ahab's family. Jehu also met Jonadab, the son of Rechab, and formed an alliance with him. Jonadab, known for his devotion to God, joined Jehu to witness his commitment to purifying Israel. This alliance symbolized a fresh start and a renewed dedication to worshiping God rightly. Jehu continued his cleansing mission in Samaria, removing all traces of Ahab's family. His dedication to fulfilling God's word, spoken through Elijah, was a turning point in Israel's history, bringing them back to obedience and reverence for God. The stories of Elijah and Elisha, alongside Jehu's actions, show how God works through prophets and chosen leaders to carry out His plans and judgments. They remind us of the importance of staying faithful to God and the serious consequences of turning away from Him. The lives and ministries of Elijah and Elisha demonstrate God's intervention and His unwavering faithfulness to His people, teaching us about obedience, trust, and serving God wholeheartedly. Through these stories, we see the special relationship between God and His prophets, based on trust, commitment, and divine intervention in crucial moments. They offer valuable lessons about faith, following God's commands, and the transformative power of His guidance and judgment. Jehu's actions, guided by Elijah's prophecy, led to a period of intense purification and a return to true worship in Israel. His determination to carry out God's judgment showed the severe consequences of idolatry and the importance of staying loyal to God's covenant. This time in Israel's history shows the ongoing struggle between faithfulness to God and the temptation of turning away from Him, underscoring the vital role of prophetic leadership in guiding the nation back to righteousness. In summary, the stories of Elijah, Elisha, and Jehu highlight the power of prophecy, the impact of God's judgment, and the constant call to faithfulness and obedience to God. They remind us of the significance of aligning our lives with God's will and the profound effects of His intervention in human affairs. These narratives not only highlight miraculous events and overcoming obstacles, but also explore the deep humanity of these men of God, who felt both divine strength and human weakness. When Elisha assumed the mantle previously worn by Elijah, he inherited more than just a prophetic role. He also shouldered the responsibility of perpetuating God's mission in Israel. While Elisha's ministry echoed Elijah's through its display of miracles, it also displayed a compassionate concern for the everyday needs of ordinary people, such as purifying the waters of Jericho and assisting a widow by multiplying her oil reserves. Elisha's actions illustrated that divine power encompassed not only acts of judgment, but also acts of compassion and sustenance for others. The transition from Elijah to Elisha underscores a significant principle in divine work: the significance of succession and mentorship. Just as Elijah mentored Elisha, the latter, in turn, invested in the next generation, symbolized by the establishment of the school of prophets. This transmission of knowledge and spiritual insight emphasizes the importance of preparing leaders who can perpetuate God's mission, ensuring the enduring impact of His teachings and deeds. Moreover, the narrative of Elijah and Elisha provides insights into God's sovereignty over all facets of existence. In a period when political upheaval and corruption posed threats to Israel's spiritual path, God intervened decisively through His prophets to reassert His authority and uphold His promises. God consistently challenged both rulers and established power systems, while also providing miraculously for His people's needs. This serves as a reminder that every aspect of our lives is under His watchful eye and providential care. The stories of prophets like Elijah and Elisha inspire us to stay true to our faith even when we encounter obstacles and feelings of discouragement. Both prophets endured periods of intense despair and isolation, yet they also felt the comfort and strengthening presence of God. Their experiences teach us that even when we find ourselves in the most challenging periods of our lives, we are never truly alone. God is always with us, ready to restore our energy and direct our paths. The lives of Elijah and Elisha stand as a strong testament to God's unwavering loyalty to His followers and His people. These stories reassure us that despite the trials and uncertainties of life, we can have faith that God is actively working within us to achieve His divine plans. These narratives encourage us to lead lives marked by obedience, service, and profound faith, reassuring us that our efforts in the Lord are meaningful and that ultimately we will see His glory and might revealed in our lives. Thus, the accounts of Elijah and Elisha are not merely historical tales of faith and miracles, but also offer enduring lessons that are relevant to our spiritual journeys today. Each story, each miracle, and each challenge they faced reflects back on us, allowing us to examine our own paths of faith, drawing wisdom and growth from their experiences. One compelling lesson from the lives of Elijah and Elisha is the transformative power of prayer and reliance on God. Both prophets maintained a constant dialogue with God, always seeking His guidance and direction. This deep connection with the Creator empowered them to navigate even the most daunting challenges with boldness and certainty. Their stories teach us that our true effectiveness and purpose come not from our own capabilities, but from the strength provided by God. Furthermore, Elijah and Elisha's lives highlight the critical role of moral and spiritual bravery. In an era where genuine faith was often compromised by idol worship and societal injustices, they remained steadfast in their dedication to God, confronting both earthly and spiritual authorities of their time. Their steadfastness motivates us to advocate for justice, cling to the truth, and conduct our lives with integrity that reflects our devotion to God, even in the face of adversity or misunderstanding. The legacy of Elijah and Elisha also emphasizes the significance of mentorship and discipleship within the faith community. Passing on wisdom, knowledge, and experiences is crucial for the development and fortification of the believers' community. Just as Elijah groomed Elisha to perpetuate God's mission, we too are encouraged to mentor those around us, sharing our life experiences and faith, thereby nurturing and strengthening the Christian community across generations. The narratives of these prophets continually remind us of God's supreme control and providential care through every hardship and triumph. In the stories about Elijah and Elisha, we see how God made things happen in amazing ways to carry out his plans. These stories remind us that God is in control of everything, working everything out for the good of those who love him and follow his plan. Elijah and Elisha weren't just tools for God when they were alive. Their stories still speak to us today, encouraging us to live lives full of strong faith, courage, dedication, and trust in God. They show us that even when things are tough, we should look beyond our immediate problems to see that God is in charge of everything. They urge us to find our hope, strength, and purpose in him. Let's learn from Elijah and Elisha's lives, allowing them to guide us into a deeper relationship with God, who never changes. Thinking about these prophets encourages us to think about our own lives and how we can grow spiritually. Their stories aren't just about amazing events and miracles. They're about men who, despite their weaknesses and struggles, passionately followed God's plan. They challenge us to think about how strong our faith is and how committed we are to following God, even when things are hard. One important lesson we can learn from them is the power of prayer. Elijah's story especially shows us how powerful prayer can be when it's consistent and sincere. When he prayed for rain, he didn't just ask once and give up. He kept praying, trusting God's promise even when it seemed impossible. This teaches us that prayer isn't about saying a lot of words. It's about having strong faith and a genuine heart. Their stories teach us about humility in a powerful way. Even though God did incredible miracles through them, Elijah and Elisha never sought fame for themselves. Instead, they always pointed to God's greatness and power. At a time when self-promotion is everywhere, their example encourages us to live humble lives, knowing that every good thing comes from God. One of the most comforting things we learn from Elijah and Elisha is how faithful God is. No matter what challenges they faced, God was always there for them. He didn't just give them what they needed and protect them. He also guided them and corrected them with love. As we deal with our own struggles, we can take comfort in knowing that we can rely on God's faithfulness. He will always be with us, no matter what. Even though Elijah and Elisha lived thousands of years ago, their stories still speak to us today. They inspire us to have strong faith, to pray always, to be humble, and to trust in God's faithfulness. May their stories inspire us to live better lives and to have a closer relationship with God. Let's aim to leave behind a legacy of faith and obedience, just like they did. This legacy can influence not only our own time, but also the generations to come, all for God's glory and the growth of his kingdom on earth. As we think about Elijah and Elisha's lives, let's see how we can follow their example in our own spiritual journey. The stories of Elijah and Elisha aren't just tales of the past. They show us what we can accomplish when we put our trust in God. Their lives invite us to build a stronger connection with our Creator, teaching us that real greatness comes from following God's guidance. Elijah and Elisha stayed faithful to God's truth, even when the society around them was going in the wrong direction. They encourage us to be lights in our own communities. In a time when things can feel uncertain and morals can seem unclear, we can look to these men as examples of holding on to our beliefs firmly. They show us how to stand up for what's right and to live with fairness and goodness. Their courage inspires us to face the challenges of our time with hope and confidence. Just like Elijah stood up to the prophets of Baal and Elisha helped those in need, we're also called to make a positive difference in our communities, using the gifts and abilities God has given us. If you found this message helpful, I encourage you to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future videos. Let's keep learning and sharing knowledge together. Thank you for being here, and may God bless you.